Fusion 360 Pro Tips. Today I'm going to go over 10 or 11 different ways of orbiting and viewing in all different sorts of scenarios in Fusion. Everything there is to know about views, orbiting, orienting your parts around. This is the video to watch. All right, let's get started. So, tip number 1. You have the ability to click any face and look directly at it. Now that means perpendicular to this face. So if I want to click this face, down here on this bar, I have look at as an option for me. Click the face, hit look at, or do that in reverse order. Fusion will orient the part and orient your view to look perpendicular at that face. Now, one of the downsides of doing this is occasionally you'll run into the issue where when you say look at, Fusion will automatically bring you into that face, but it will have your file turned 90 degrees or some other random um, amount of degrees off of what you want. Now, in this case, I want this face up. And there have been many times where I look at this face and Fusion orients it the wrong way. So beware, that's normal. Sometimes you can fix that by coming over here to your view cube up in the top right and use these arrows to flip yourself 90 degrees. But sometimes, especially on more complicated or amorphous shapes, those arrows won't exist. If you notice here, I'm looking at my part not square to the origin of this file. I no longer have the option to click those arrows. So beware. Look at can be useful, but there are some downsides potentially. Now, that brings us to the view cube up here. Now we have a lot of different functions built into this view cube. You've probably found out that you can click any of these faces and your file will orient to that face. You can click a corner and you can look at basically an isometric view of your part from the corner. You can click any of the edge corners, and you'll be looking basically 45 degrees between, in this case, the top and the front. Additionally, you can click and drag with just a normal left mouse click. You can click and drag your view cube and orient or orbit in this way. That's not a way I use very often, but you can do it. And here we have the home selection, and this is going to orient your model into the home view. Now, the home view I'll get into in just a second, but it has to do with named views. Any file, when you start it in Fusion, is going to have these 4 named views to start. And home is a special it's a special named view that is linked to this icon near your view cube, and it'll bring you here. Now, if you want to reset where your home is, maybe I want my home looking at this corner. What I can do is orient to how I want, right-click the view cube, and then I will say set my current view as home, and it's usually best to say fit to view. If I click that, now if I orbit somewhere else and then click home again, it now shows the corner that I set home as. But let's say I no longer wanted that. I can again right click and say reset home, click the button, and it'll come back to what Fusion originally called home, which is always this view looking at basically this orientation of X, Y, and Z. Okay, so your view cube is really powerful. It can do a bunch. It's very useful. Now, you'll notice as I'm orbiting around these parts, I'm not using the view cube. So this brings us to tip number 3, which is the middle mouse button to orbit. Now, I have a fairly standard computer mouse. It's got a left and a right button, and it's got a scroll wheel in the middle, which of course is used for zooming. And if I click down on that scroll wheel, I get the ability to orbit. Now, this is what I use most commonly. Almost always, I am either zooming out, zooming in, and based on where I have my mouse, I'm zooming in or out to where my cursor is, and that's how I orient around a part. Um, that's going to be 99% of what I'm doing. But sometimes if I want to look square onto this part, I might just go up here and click the right face on the view cube. So tip number 3 is about the mouse middle wheel button. When you push down on your wheel, with the settings that I currently have, and we'll get to that in a second, it will orbit around however you want. Now, a couple tips on this that I didn't learn until after a while of using Fusion. When you are orbiting, do you see the green dot that is in the middle of my part right now? That is the orbit center. Now, you can change your orbit center by right-clicking any blank space, and then we see Set Orbit Center. Now I get to click and choose exactly where my orbit center is. So if I clicked maybe this corner of my part, why not, and then tried to orbit, you can see that that orbit center has changed, and it completely affects the feel as I'm orbiting my part around. I'm not very fond of how this feels right now. And of course, you can set it way out uh, somewhere else, and if you can visualize, this part is revolving about the center. Now you can always right click and say reset, and it'll go to where it originally was. It's normally near the um, basically the center of mass of your part. It's not, I want to show here, it's not where your origin of the file is. Normally it's where the center of mass of your part is. So that's a quick tip if you're trying to find where the center of mass of a part is or trying to adjust that. Your orbit center automatically gets placed where the center of mass of your part is. So next, I had mentioned the settings of my orbiting for my middle mouse button. I want to go over those settings because you can affect the nature of what it's doing. If I go up in top right corner and I'm going to open up my preferences, here I see all of the preferences that I have, and if I click on General, the very first page of this, it has what I'm looking for. If I scroll down to the bottom, I see these preferences of pan, zoom, orbit, shortcuts. And really what I want to highlight in this 4th tip is coming from SolidWorks, I used to be a SolidWorks, I choose to have my Fusion pan, zoom, orbit shortcuts set to a SolidWorks methodology, if you will. But if I drop down here, your default is going to be Fusion. So if you are trying to orbit with your middle mouse button, and instead it's panning or zooming or doing something that looks different than mine, it's likely because yours is set to Fusion. I recommend, based on how I work with a keyboard and a mouse, setting it to SolidWorks. It's going to be fairly intuitive, especially for SolidWorks users. The default orbit type of being free orbit is the one that I find gives me the most control. The alternative is constrained orbit, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, if you have a preference of which direction your zoom direction is based on your scroll wheel, you can flip it with this toggle here. That's very nice. I'll say apply and say OK. Okay, so tip number 5 was you can change your zoom direction. I missed that looking at my list here. Many drawing programs, CAD, CAM, everything, all these programs flip-flop on whether scrolling up or scrolling down is zoom in. And so many people are frustrated when a program like Fusion is the opposite of what they're used to. Okay, now I hinted at it, but we're going to talk about constrained orbit. This is tip 6, constrained orbit. Hypothetically, if I am looking at my part like this, and I want to have more control over what angle I'm looking at this part, I don't just want to randomly orbit to try to look at this part at an angle. I want to be controlled about it. So that's where I like to use constrained orbit. You can get to that down here. It's the leftmost button on this tab, or this bar down here. You drop down and say constrained orbit, and it's very faint to see, but it gives you sort of a crosshair looking thing, like a reticle almost, on your screen. And if you hover your mouse over different areas, you'll be able to do different things. So I'm going to hover it over the circle of this, I'll call it crosshairs, and it gives me the icon of revolve. If I click and start dragging, it constrains my orbit to the basically to rotate about to the axis that I'm looking down. So if I want to look at this part directly at this face, but affect the angle that the part is at, this is a great way to do that. Alternatively, if I want to rotate my part side to side, you can see that it just jumped there. I don't love that. The thing about constrained orbit is it's got problems, and I don't know why. I don't know. I'm probably being picky, but it doesn't give you the control that I think it should. And so if I'm looking at this face maybe this way with my Z of the file oriented upwards, and I say constrained orbit, and then I clicked one of these side lines, I can constrain my orbit just to this axis or this plane. And same thing like this, and I can rotate it like so, but notice it just jumped. It's a little touchy, so it's hit or miss. Use it to your own peril. So I'm going to switch back to free orbit. That's my preference. And hey, I learned something just now. If I click on free orbit and use the crosshairs, it doesn't flip on me. So there you go. We're learning together. I have never tried that. Great. Okay. Whoever needs constrained orbit, that just limits you. All right. So tip 7, named views. Now I mentioned the default named views that Fusion comes in with, but I have gotten in the habit of using named views more and making my own. So in the case of this part, this wall on the inside, for example, if I look at it from the side, maybe I'll do a section analysis and look at it like that. You can tell that this wall is angled. It's got a 10-degree angle to it. So I want to look down this angle. And so what I'm going to do is make a named view once I'm oriented looking down this wall. For now, it might be a little bit tricky to look properly down that wall, but we'll get there in a second. I don't want to jump to another tip yet. But let's say this was a view that I really wanted. What I can do is right-click on Named Views, say New Named View, and ideally, I'm going to rename that view to, I don't know, I was going to say random. How about obscure? um, when I then orbit somewhere else and I want to get back to my named view, I can just click it in this menu of named views and it goes there. Now, if I want to tweak this a little bit, and actually I want it there, I can update this named view by right-clicking and saying Update Named View. Now my new position is the named view. Orbit away, click this, and there we go. I can look at the bottom, update named view, maybe go home. Now click obscure, and it's looking at the bottom. So named views are very helpful, especially views that are looking perpendicular or parallel to certain faces, depending on what you're doing in CAD or CAM. So the next tip, this is tip 8, has to do more with visual styles. Now, we've been working down here on this bar, and if you drill into display settings, it's third from the right, you get a bunch of options. In this case, I'm going to highlight over visual style and point out that there are 6 different visual styles that you can use. Now, default is shaded with visible edges only. That's how we're looking at it here, and it gives us a little indicator that says we're currently using this view, or this visual style, pardon me. But constantly, in the case where maybe I wanted to see if this wall is angled, but I didn't want to have to make a section analysis to do that, what I often do is use the shortcuts for my visual styles. So you can see here on the right, I'm a Windows user, so for me it's Control. On a Mac it's going to be likely Command plus 4 or 5 all the way through 9. So I am constantly going between Control 6, which is my default, and Control 7, which is wireframe. Let me show you what that looks like. I don't have to drill into these pages. I can just use the shortcuts, Control plus 6. So I'm on Control 6 right now. I'm going to do Control plus 7, and now I get a wireframe view. I can look through my part, and the advantage here is I can see very clearly that this wall is angled. I can look through my part and then quickly return with Control 6 back to a solid shaded model. Now play around with Control 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 yourself. I'm often using Control 4 as well, especially if I'm working on a model that has complex curves and I want to make sure that those curves are blended nicely, that there aren't any geometries that lines on the CAD model are causing me not to be able to see so well. So Control 4 is really nice for seeing it without those lines. Control 4, just for reference, is just shaded, not with edges. All right, so that is visual styles and using those shortcuts, Control 4, or Control plus your number keypad. Now, the next tip, this is number 9. Also in this display settings button, or tab, if you will, is environment. Now, environment is your background, essentially. By default, Fusion does photo booth. That's the white background that I have now. but sometimes I find myself switching from photo booth to gray room, and this is nicer on my eyes, especially on a long day of modeling, where it's nice just not to be so bright. It's halfway to a dark mode, um, but not all the way. I don't want to change the appearance of my entire Fusion workspace, um, because I'm so accustomed to what the icons look like right now. I don't want to change um, the look of Fusion as a whole, but sometimes it's nice to change the background to a gray. And the other nice reason to change it to a darker color, and this is one of the reasons I use most often, is for double checking, especially on like a CNC router situation, checking that my no tool paths are going down past my part into the table. Some of these yellow, that should be a rare occurrence, but some of the light yellows and light greens are hard to see against the white background. And so I'll switch it, the display setting environment, to gray room to have higher contrast between the background and the line types of a toolpath. Play around with what environments you like. I've I've seen various ones being used by different users, and to each their own. Now I'm going to change mine back to photo booth, and then I'm going to look at effects. Now I recommend turning off your Fusion 360 effects. Environment dome, ground plane, object shadow, these different things, they slightly change the appearance of your model, and maybe in certain cases it's helpful, but I have found that by and large they only serve to slow down the not the rendering but the orbiting of your part. It is using more GPU in order to do that. So if you want to be modeling faster and not have sluggish responses to orbiting and moving, I would recommend turning off those effects. Um, okay, so now we're going to jump to the cam side a little bit. Um, let's say that I wanted to machine this face, and remember this is the face that has an angle. If I go to manufacturing, I have just a setup with just this one toolpath setup. I want to do a ramp, and of course, I can't machine this part or this face with a standard end mill from perpendicular. This would be in the case where if I had a fourth or fifth axis. And I am using my, on the multi-axis tab of my toolpath, I'm using tool orientation. Now, tool orientation is really powerful. You can do it with a bunch of different ways. You could control it with these handles, which affects the tilt and turn, and you can manually affect what angle it is. Alternatively, you can, I'll go back into that. Alternatively, you can use align to view. Now, this is a powerful, if not dangerous, tool to use because it could be very easy to set this to an axis that you might not have. Let's say I'm doing this on a fourth axis, but I wasn't careful. It might want to try to do it in a 5-axis, an angle that only a 5-axis could do. So be careful. But this would be where I would make a named view, maybe looking straight parallel to this wall. Hypothetically, let's just say not parallel to that wall, but let's say right here. If I say align to view, notice how my Z is now pointing right at me, and it updated my turn and tilt values. So this is a nice way, especially if you have a 5-axis, where you just have a hard to reach area. You just want to say, okay, approach it from this angle, whatever I'm looking at it, align to view. Really, really nice and easy to do it that way. But sometimes you want to be more precise with your align to view. So I want to go back to my design tab or workspace and talk about this hole and this square. Now, I modeled these at kind of a funny angle. I can do that by pressing I for measure, and I will click this face and this face, and it didn't give it to me. I'll try again. Do not show snap points. This face and this face. There we go. The angle is 80.15 degrees, not a standard angle. Now, if I wanted in the design workspace to look straight in the axis that this shape is cut, it's very hard to do it. Fusion does not have a very good way of doing so. If I looked at this face with the look at tool, and see there it spun around on me, I didn't want it to do that. But if I look at this face, it's not facing down the square, of course. And so I could get close maybe with these handles, right, and do it that way, but that's still not exact. So, and I've run into many situations where I have to look exactly straight down a cut shape. So I want to show you how to do that. We'll start with a square. It's a little bit easier than the circle is. On a square, or any shape that has lines traversing parallel to the direction of cut, what I can do is select one of those lines, go to Construct, and then say Plane Along Path. A plane along path is going to put a plane perpendicular to the line that I selected, and I can choose where that plane goes, but in this case it does not matter. I'll just say OK wherever it is. Remember, I'm only trying to look directly down this hole. I'm going to click this face and then say look at, and it rotated and oriented on its own. But there we go. I'm now looking straight down the square, and if I do a wireframe view, I can see that my walls are completely perpendicular to my view. A side note, if you are using the camera perspective view, you won't see it. Basically, you won't see the walls perfectly lined up because perspective view is kind of like our eyes. You're going to have parallax. Things farther away from the camera are going to be smaller. I recommend if you're doing anything in Fusion that is precise or engineering or programming, I highly recommend doing orthographic as your view type. But you can see that I cannot get these walls or these lines to line up with one another unless I click this plane and say look at, and that's exactly what I wanted. Now, let me try one a little bit harder, and that is this circle. A perfect circle will not have a line that is, on one of the edges. So we have to make our own line in order to do a plane along path method. Here's how I normally do that. It's a little bit obtuse, and Fusion, if you're watching, I really wish this was a better feature within the look at, to be able to look at something other than a plane or a flat surface. But here's how I look down a circle. Construct, axis through cylinder, and I click the walls of the cylinder. Say OK. Now, it would be so nice to be able to construct a plane along path and select this axis. But unfortunately, it can't, because a path, by definition, has a start and an end. And obviously, an axis is an infinitely long direction. It does not have a start and an end. So it wasn't quite that simple. So what we have to do now that we have our axis is construct a plane at angle. This is the easiest way to do this, in my opinion. Plane at angle. I'm going to click my axis, and the angle does not matter. It doesn't matter at all. It can be anything. But plane at angle is the easiest way to get a plane crossing through this axis. I'll say OK. Now on this plane, I'll create a sketch, and I will do P on my keyboard for project. And if I highlight the axis, it will project that axis. Fortunately, it doesn't project my axis infinitely long. That would be undesired. It actually only projects just as long as the axis was being displayed. So that's great. And if I hide my axis, you can see here is my projected line. Now we have something that we can use as a path that has a start and end. I'll say finish. Construct plane along path. Select your line. You don't care where your plane is. And then you click your plane and say look at. And we did it. So that is the convoluted method of looking down a circle where there are no parallel lines. Now, alternatively, if you can, I found a way that saves one step, but it has a downside, and let me show you that. Instead of doing the axis, what I do is construct a tangent plane and click the sidewalls of the circle and say OK. Wait for it to buffer. There we go. So I've got a plane, it's tangent to my circle. Now I can, under Modify, choose Split Face. I'll choose that face of my circle, and then for my splitting tool, I'll select my plane and say OK. Now and I'll hide my plane, because it was tangent to my hole, it's not cutting my hole in half. Fusion recognizes it as only putting one line in your circle. So this gets you a path that is parallel to your circle without having to make an axis and then a sketch of that axis. So I can use this and plane along path to do the same thing. However, the downside with that method is it puts this line and it cuts this face of your hole. So if you're doing something, especially in CAM, that might require this face to be continuous in order to work right, this might not be the way you want to do it, but it does save at least one step in your timeline. So in the case of my angled wall, that is this wall here, I am going to make a named view that's looking straight down it. So I'm going to select this line, do a plane along path, and I'm going to click that plane and say look at. And if I do Control 7, I can go wireframe and see that I am truly looking straight down that face. Now, if I were to look at the top, that's my angled face right here. That wouldn't work. But if I look at this plane that I just made, now I am looking parallel to that plane. So I'm going to make a named view and call it angle wall. Okay, I'm heading back over to the manufacture tab, and for my ramp toolpath, I am going to go to multi-axis, tool orientation. Now, there's a few different ways of doing this. The Z-axis, actually I'll skip that for a moment. The align to view tool is what I'm going to use. So I'm going to go to the named view tab. And it's not showing up in manufacturing. Ooh, I just learned that too. Interesting. So manufacturing has its own um, named views separate from the design side. That's a bummer. But I still have this plane. I can just click it, say look at, and then make a new named view in the manufacturing side. So angled wall 2. Um, Now I can go into my ramp toolpath, multi-axis, and align to view. That's going to be parallel to my angled wall here. Now another way to affect the tool orientation, which is really nice, they've built a lot of power into this. So for my z-axis, I can just as easily click this line and it aligns. That didn't move because it was already aligned. So let me try again. Select this line and it adjusts. Very easy. If I were to select this face, it would be perpendicular to that face, which is not what I want. However, I could click this face and then adjust my tilt, in this case by negative 90 degrees, and that would also be aligned with this wall. So there's a lot of view adjustability within tool orientation. Okay, and lastly, I want to show you in the Design tab the power of Find in Browser or Find in Window. This is not a large assembly file. Of course, there's only one part here, but I often work in large assemblies where it's hard to find in my browser where a certain part, fastener, sketch is actually located. So I want to show you a few different ways of doing finding things quickly. So I'm going to start by right-clicking on my part. Now, of course, as I highlight it or hover my mouse over it, it does highlight the body. That's nice. But if I had those closed and I didn't know where it was, I could right-click and say Find in Browser, and it'll open up the file structure or the folder structure and highlight the body that it is. That's really nice when you're working on assemblies that have sub-assemblies where you have layers of components. And sure, if you click something, it might highlight where it is, but if it's 5 layers deep in components, it can still be a pain. So I am often right-clicking on a body, a component, a sketch, anything, and saying find in browser, and it will open up to what you want. Now, I have found that to be less than, it doesn't always work with sketches. If I say find in browser with a sketch, in this case it worked. Sometimes it won't fully open up the entire structure to find that sketch, so beware, but it gets you closer. The uh, other nice thing is if I right click, nope, I did that wrong. If I right click something in my browser, let's say this body, and say find in window, it's going to center the part that I chose in my window. This is exceptionally helpful if I'm working in an assembly with tons of parts. Maybe it's hard to identify which part is which, but you can tell in your browser, oh, no, I want this one. You can say isolate, so it's only going to be that part, and then you can say find in window, and it's going to center it for you. You don't have to look around, it'll just show up. I was trying to think, it seems like there was another really helpful way of doing that. You can actually, I don't know why you'd want to, but you can right click a body and say find in window, and it will um, clearly not perfectly center, but it'll roughly center what you clicked on in your view. But that's the same as just zooming out and zooming in and going and looking at that part. If you're able to click it to say find in window, I don't know why you can't find it in the window. But um, find in browser, find in window by right-clicking things is exceptionally helpful. I use those all the time to save time and sanity in finding things quickly. All right, hope you guys enjoyed. That was a long video. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you have a good day. Take care.